Hey y'all, Dave here. It's been a while since I did any kind of response videos or questions for atheists videos. I do have a playlist of videos that I intend on responding to, but I just haven't gotten around to them yet. So I figured it was about time I started clearing up some of that backlog. In this one, I'm going to be responding to Christian apologist Sean McDowell's YouTube short titled Best Cues to Ask an Atheist. Not only is it a short, but it's a short? Who wears short shorts? We wear short shorts. At only 36 seconds. As you can tell by the title of Sean's video, it is about what he thinks the best questions to ask an atheist are. I'll play the video and then interject with my responses whenever he asks the questions. So let's get the video playing.
Best questions to ask an atheist? What do you mean by atheism?
Generally, when I use the term atheism, I mean the claim or belief that God does not exist, or strong, positive, explicit atheism.
When did you become an atheist?
So this one is a little more complicated. It's simpler to say that I just have never been religious and have never believed in God. If I was to put an age on it though, I would say at around 12 or 13, as that's when I first really began to understand the arguments and the claims for the existence of God, as well as for the claims of Christianity, which was the prevalent religion around me growing up.
Did you ever believe in God?
Okay, so I might have jumped the gun a little in my last response. No, I have never believed in God. My parents were atheist and agnostic, but that's not to say that I was never introduced to the concept of God or religion. Just that the concept of God and religion was introduced to me much later in my life. My grandparents had my folks send me to Sunday school when I was younger, and society was very Christian at the time, so I was also surrounded by Christianity and by Christians. In school, the Lord's Prayer was said every morning, and I was given a Bible by a visiting group from Gideon's International, which I read and found very unconvincing. Friends also took me to church with them in the hopes of convincing me of the existence of God. However, none of it was ever particularly convincing. While I was only young, I had reasons that stopped me from believing it. Eventually, as I got older, I began to look into it and discuss the topic with others, which led to me taking the position that God does not exist.
What's your experience with Christians?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I'm an old man now, so my experience is long and varied. I have many friends that are Christian. There have been Christians that I've disliked and Christians that I've liked. Some Christians have treated me well, and some Christians have been complete bellends. Christians are like anyone else, where some people are good and some people are asshats. The same can be said of atheists, Muslims, agnostics, Hindus, and any other group of people.
What, if anything, might cause you to reconsider your beliefs?
This is another very complicated question. In all honesty, I'm not entirely sure. I'm at a point now where it seems unlikely that simple argumentation is going to do the trick. There are some arguments that I find interesting, but they're just not very compelling. I don't believe that there is no evidence for God. I just find that evidence to be very weak, and completely overwhelmed by the evidence against the existence of God and the evidence for naturalism, and find naturalism to be a far better explanation for my experiences in the world, which is one of the things that I think it would take to make me reconsider my beliefs. Some kind of experience that turns my acceptance of naturalism on its head. For example, some kind of religious experience, or some kind of supernatural experience, or if some piece of data was found that overturned naturalism completely, like us finding a species on Earth that simply could not be explained by evolution, or even the sudden appearance of a brand new species all across the world. Another thing that might get me to reconsider my beliefs is finding out the answer to certain mysteries, like discovering that there really was nothing before the appearance of the universe, or scientists discovering that there simply is no way to explain the appearance of life using natural means. And by this, I don't mean things like the probability argument that many Christians use, but instead a consensus from those working on abiogenesis suddenly turning around and saying, you know what? This is impossible. There are also other things related to my personal life that might get me to reconsider too, such as the sudden disappearance of illnesses and pain, or my life becoming everything I want it to be. That would probably do it as well. Of course, the blowing of the trumpets and the sudden appearance of Jesus in the sky coming down to bring about an Armageddon would probably do the trick too. Like I say, this one is complicated, as I can't really say with any kind of certainty what would change my mind. Human psychology and beliefs are complicated things, but these are some of the things I have often thought of that would change my mind.
Those are the kinds of questions I like to begin with. Now, eventually, I want to get to the big question. Why is there something rather than nothing?
Okay, Sean really does like to ask the big and complicated questions, doesn't he? This one is a little simpler for me than the last one, though. It's also a question that somewhat gets at the heart of one of the reasons I believe God doesn't exist. How so? Well, just like Christians, I share the idea that the universe didn't come from nothing. The idea that there was ever nothing is something that just doesn't make sense. If we consider here the idea of nothing as a state that is the absence of everything, then, as many Christians and Muslims like to argue, nothing could come from it. It would be an absence of everything, including physics, physical laws, fields, and anything else you could assume. The moment you assume something of it, then it's no longer nothing. There are atheists and skeptics that make arguments about being unable to know the kind of things that a state of nothingness could do, but these just simply aren't very convincing to me. So as far as I'm concerned, the idea of there ever having been an absence of everything is just nonsense, meaning that there must always have been something. Of course, this is where Christians and I part ways in the idea of there always having been something. As far as I'm concerned, that something was necessarily something natural and something physical. Well, the Christian believes that something was God. However, they still believe that nothing existed, so to speak. Many still argue that the universe came from nothing, and that God was the necessary being that brought everything from nothing. That doesn't really work for me, though. The claim that there was an absence of everything before God created everything means that God existed in absolute nothingness, which, as far as I'm concerned, is nonsensical. It seems to me that something cannot exist in an absence of everything. Many Christians will argue that God is immaterial and therefore does not take up space, and therefore it doesn't apply to God. But that still sounds nonsensical to me. Some argue that God is pure being, but calling something pure being sounds nonsensical when you also argue that this God exists in a complete lack of being. Others have argued that claiming that God needs somewhere to exist makes God contingent, and God is non-contingent, so it can't be the case that God needs somewhere to exist, which is fine for those willing to accept that, but that's just not a very convincing argument to me. So, I believe it was never the case that there was nothing. The only answer that actually makes sense to me is that there was always something, and that something was necessarily physical.
Where did life come from?
I mentioned earlier that there are things that I find as evidence for God, and this question kind of hits on one of those things. I'm unsure of where life came from. God does appear to be a reasonable explanation in this case, though not the Christian God. It seems to me to be more likely that some kind of deistic conception of God is more likely, if God is likely at all. Naturalism seems to me to be the better explanation, even if I can't explain it. Many argue that Christianity can explain where life comes from, and that's something in its favor. But as far as I'm concerned, Christianity can't actually explain where life came from because of the problems with the Christian conception of God.
The origin of consciousness.
I think the origin of consciousness is natural. It's something that has evolved slowly over time. There are problems with the physicalist conception of mind that stops me from accepting it fully, but it seems to me to be the most likely explanation. This is another one where the existence of God does offer a simpler explanation, but it suffers from the same problems as using the Christian God to explain where life came from.
Objective moral values and duties.
For a long time during my undergrad, I was a moral realist. Now I'm not so sure. I lean more towards an anti-realist stance these days, and do not think that there are objective moral duties, at least not in the sense that someone like Sean is arguing. Those objective moral values and duties that do exist are socially constructed. My thoughts on morality have become far more complicated than they were, and like I say, I lean more towards an anti-realism stance these days.
And who is Jesus?
This is a pretty interesting question, and I can see why Sean would ask it. After all, it could be the case that we are rejecting Jesus while not knowing anything about Jesus or his message. I'm not a Jesus mythicist, so I believe there was a historical Jesus. The mythicist arguments simply are not convincing to me. As argued by Tim O'Neill, it's far more likely that Christianity arose from an actual person and movement based on how it is written. There are things in the New Testament where details are written in such a way to match the man to the prophecies, which wouldn't be necessary if Jesus was cut from mythicist cloth. So I think Jesus was a historical figure who created a new movement in his time, something similar to Muhammad or even Joseph Smith. But I also think Jesus is more than that too, and that Jesus means many things to many people.
But to me, those questions are often downstream from first getting to know the person and hearing their story.
I kind of like what Sean has to say at the end of this short, that many of these questions come downstream in the conversation. It's first important to get to know the person and their story, which I think is an important message and something that the vast majority of Christians and even Muslims forget or ignore. Atheists, like Christians, all have very different stories to tell about their beliefs, why they believe what they do, their stances, and everything else. Just as too many atheists make far too many presuppositions about the attitudes and beliefs of Christians, so too do too many Christians do the same about atheists. Conversation, understanding, and getting to know people is more important than simply going in trying to dissuade them of their current position. Of course, there has to be authenticity to that getting to know them too. Anyway, that's it for this one. See you all soon. I hope life treats you well until next time. Bye.